You were told Jesus wept because he was spiritually overwhelmed, because the weight of humanity's sin pressed down on him in a mystical moment of sorrow beneath olive trees in the dark. That explanation has survived for centuries because it sounds sacred, emotional, understandable. But there's a detail inside the Gospel of Luke that changes the entire scene if you stop reading it symbolically and start reading it clinically. Luke writes that Jesus' sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground, not metaphorical sorrow, not poetic anguish, blood. And for nearly 2,000 years, readers have argued over whether Luke meant that literally, because if he did, then the Garden of Gethsemane was not simply a spiritual crisis. It was a catastrophic physiological event unfolding in real time before the crucifixion even began. This video is not asking whether the story is true. That is a different conversation. This video asks something narrower and far stranger. If a human being actually begins sweating blood under extreme psychological stress, what does modern medicine say is happening inside the body at that moment? What kind of trauma produces it? How close to physical collapse does someone have to be before capillaries rupture through the skin itself? Because the answer is disturbing. The condition has a name, hematidrosis, and it changes the way the final hours of Jesus look entirely. The Gospel of Luke is the only canonical gospel that explicitly describes the phenomenon. Luke chapter 22 verses 44 says, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." That sentence has generated centuries of debate because of one specific Greek phrase, hose thromboi haimatos, like drops of blood. Some readers interpret the wording comparatively, sweat falling heavily like blood. Others argue Luke is describing actual blood mixed with perspiration. But here is what makes the passage medically significant. Luke was traditionally understood to be a physician. Whether or not that attribution is historically precise, the author of Luke consistently uses more medically detailed language than the other gospel writers when describing illness, injury, and physical conditions. And the image he chooses here is unusually specific. Not tears, not trembling, not weakness, blood emerging through sweat. Modern medicine recognizes hematidrosis as an extremely rare condition associated with severe psychological stress, acute fear, or catastrophic trauma. The mechanism is still not completely understood because the condition itself is so uncommon that few physicians ever encounter a confirmed case directly. But documented cases exist across medical literature. Under conditions of overwhelming stress, the tiny capillaries surrounding sweat glands can rupture. Blood enters the sweat ducts and is expelled through the skin mixed with perspiration. A person literally sweats blood. The body reaches a threshold where psychological terror begins producing visible vascular damage. Think carefully about what that means. The body is not responding to external violence yet. No scourging has started. No nails. No crown of thorns. Gethsemane occurs before the arrest, before the trial, before physical torture begins. The collapse starts in anticipation. That distinction matters medically because anticipatory trauma can produce physiological reactions more severe than the injury itself. Modern neuroscience has demonstrated that the human nervous system often responds not only to pain but to the certainty of approaching pain. Fear is not abstract inside the body. It is chemical, hormonal, electrical. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream. Heart rate accelerates. Blood vessels constrict. Cortisol surges. The body enters survival mode at maximum intensity. If sustained long enough, the stress response itself becomes destructive. There are documented cases from prisoners awaiting execution, soldiers before battle, and patients undergoing catastrophic fear responses where blood pressure spikes so violently that capillary structures fail. The body begins injuring itself from terror alone. That possibility transforms the Garden of Gethsemane from a symbolic prayer scene into something medically horrifying. Because if Luke is describing hematidrosis literally, then Jesus was already entering systemic physiological collapse before Roman soldiers ever touched him. Now consider the timing described in the narrative itself. Jesus repeatedly tells his disciples that his death is approaching. He predicts betrayal, arrest, execution, humiliation, public torture. He anticipates not only pain, but a very specific form of pain. Roman crucifixion was not mysterious in the first century. People knew exactly what it looked like. Crucifixion was designed not merely to kill, but to psychologically dismantle the victim before death arrived. The condemned were stripped publicly, beaten publicly, displayed publicly, forced into maximum humiliation while slowly suffocating over hours or days. The anticipation alone would have been psychologically devastating, and that is before adding the theological dimension carried inside the narrative itself. Jesus does not simply fear death in the abstract. He speaks repeatedly about abandonment, judgment, and the approaching cup he must drink. The language reflects not only physical dread, but profound existential isolation. Whether one interprets that spiritually or psychologically, the effect on the body would be real. The nervous system does not distinguish neatly between physical threat and catastrophic emotional trauma. Both activate the same survival machinery. This is one reason hematidrosis fascinates physicians. It represents one of the clearest demonstrations that mental suffering can become physically visible, emotion crossing directly into tissue, and the rarity of the condition matters. Hematidrosis is not ordinary anxiety. It is not everyday stress. Most people experiencing fear do not rupture blood vessels through their skin. The cases documented in medical literature are typically associated with extreme psychological conditions bordering on total nervous system overload, which raises an uncomfortable question. If Luke's description is medically accurate, how severe was the agony in Gethsemane actually supposed to be? Because the scene is often portrayed softly in religious art. Moonlight, quiet sorrow, gentle tears beneath olive trees. The clinical picture is much darker. Imagine the physiological state required for hematidrosis to occur. Heart pounding uncontrollably, blood pressure surging, skin weakened by vascular rupture, sweating heavily while blood emerges from the pores, muscles tightening under prolonged stress response, severe dehydration beginning before physical torture even starts, the body entering shock before the violence arrives. And there is another medical implication that becomes important once the crucifixion begins. Hematidrosis leaves the skin unusually tender and fragile. Physicians who have studied the condition note that the rupture of capillaries and intense sympathetic activation can create hypersensitivity across the skin surface. Now place that detail beside Roman scourging. The Roman flagrum was not a simple whip. It consisted of multiple leather thongs embedded with metal fragments, bone, or weighted objects designed to tear tissue open on impact. Roman scourging alone sometimes killed victims before crucifixion ever occurred. If Jesus entered the scourging already physiologically compromised from hematidrosis, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and acute stress response, the damage inflicted afterward would likely have been amplified dramatically. The body would already be weakened before the first strike landed. This matters because the gospel narratives consistently portray Jesus deteriorating physically before reaching Golgotha. He struggles carrying the crossbeam. Another man, Simon of Cyrene, is compelled to carry it part of the way. That detail has often been interpreted spiritually, but medically, it may indicate severe cardiovascular exhaustion already underway. The sequence becomes disturbingly coherent when viewed clinically. Extreme psychological trauma, hematidrosis, sleep deprivation, dehydration, massive sympathetic nervous system activation, scourging, blood loss, circulatory instability, collapse beneath the crossbeam, crucifixion. The progression aligns with what trauma medicine would expect from catastrophic multi-system stress. Now, there is an objection often raised against the hematidrosis interpretation. Some scholars argue Luke may simply be using symbolic language, sweat falling like blood rather than actual blood itself. That possibility deserves serious consideration because ancient writers frequently use vivid imagery, but there is something important about Luke's broader writing style. Luke consistently grounds miraculous or emotional moments in physical detail. He notices bodies, symptoms, touch, hunger, exhaustion, bleeding, paralysis, fever. The texture of physical experience matters in his narrative more than in many ancient religious texts. An early Christian tradition repeatedly preserved this scene not as poetic exaggeration, but as evidence of the intensity of Christ's suffering before the crucifixion began. There's also the fact that hematidrosis itself would have been extraordinarily difficult for ancient audiences to invent convincingly. It is too medically strange, too specific, too biologically counterintuitive. Ancient writers had no modern understanding of stress physiology or capillary rupture mechanisms. Yet the description aligns remarkably closely with a real, documented condition. That does not prove the event happened historically, but it complicates the assumption that the image was merely decorative symbolism. Now step back further and consider the deeper implication underneath all this. The Garden of Gethsemane may represent one of the earliest surviving descriptions of trauma-induced physiological collapse in literature, long before modern psychiatry, long before neuroscience, long before endocrinology. An ancient text may be documenting the body breaking down under psychological terror with startling clinical accuracy, and that possibility changes the emotional architecture of the entire passion narrative, because many portrayals of Jesus emphasize composure during suffering, calm authority, divine certainty, transcendent control. Gethsemane disrupts that image completely. The figure in the garden is distressed, trembling, overwhelmed, begging for the ordeal to pass if possible, his body reacting violently before the torture even starts. Not distant from human fear, inside it completely. That humanity becomes even sharper when you compare Gethsemane to what modern trauma studies now understand about anticipatory suffering. Researchers studying extreme stress consistently find that uncertainty and anticipation often produce greater psychological strain than pain itself. The imagination becomes an amplifier. The nervous system rehearses catastrophe before it arrives. Execution survivors, torture survivors, and prisoners awaiting violence often describe the period before the event as psychologically unbearable. The mind cycles endlessly through approaching horror. Sleep collapses. Stress hormones remain elevated continuously. The body cannot reset. Gethsemane reads disturbingly close to that pattern. Jesus repeatedly returns a prayer, repeatedly confronts a coming ordeal mentally before it arrives physically. The narrative describes isolation, exhaustion, sorrow, and escalating anguish while the disciples nearby fall asleep, unable to grasp the magnitude of what is unfolding. The loneliness inside the scene is profound, and medically, isolation intensifies stress responses further. Human beings regulate fear socially. Presence matters. Support matters. Shared vigilance matters. Isolation removes those stabilizing mechanisms. The nervous system becomes more vulnerable under threat when left alone. The Gethsemane narrative repeatedly emphasizes abandonment. The disciples sleep. One disciple betrays him. The arrest approaches. The body enters collapse. Now consider another detail often overlooked. Luke says the sweat fell to the ground, not merely appearing on the skin, falling visibly enough to be noticed in darkness. If interpreted literally, the description implies substantial bleeding mixed with perspiration, enough fluid loss to become externally observable, and blood loss matters profoundly in the hours ahead. Crucifixion kills partly through asphyxiation, partly through shock, partly through cardiovascular collapse. But pre-crucifixion blood loss dramatically accelerates the process. A body entering crucifixion, already compromised, becomes less capable of surviving prolonged trauma, which makes another gospel detail medically significant. In the Gospel of John, after Jesus dies, a Roman soldier pierces his side with a spear, and John describes blood and water flowing out. That phrase has generated enormous medical speculation. Some physicians interpret it as possible pericardial or pleural fluid accumulation associated with severe trauma and circulatory failure. Again, not proof, but the physiological coherence across the narrative is striking. A body under catastrophic stress, severe trauma, fluid imbalance, circulatory collapse, death. The passion narrative increasingly resembles not only theological storytelling, but the progression of extreme physical deterioration under torture conditions. And yet, Gethsemane remains the psychological center of it all, because that is where the collapse begins internally, before the nails, before the cross, before the public spectacle. The body begins breaking under the anticipation of suffering itself. That may be why the scene continues to disturb readers across centuries, even outside explicitly religious contexts. It captures something universally human about fear at its absolute limit. Not courage without terror. Courage while terror is fully present. And there is one final detail that deserves attention. In Luke's account, immediately after describing the agony and bloody sweat, an angel appears strengthening Jesus. That detail is easy to spiritualize abstractly, but within the medical reading of the scene, it becomes psychologically revealing. The body has reached a threshold where support becomes necessary simply to continue. Ancient writers lacked the vocabulary of nervous system overload or acute stress pathology, but they understood exhaustion, collapse, breaking points. The narrative recognizes that something inside Gethsemane nearly destroys him before the crucifixion even begins. And that recognition changes the emotional weight of everything that follows. Because the crucifixion was not simply endured by a body already calm and prepared. According to Luke's description, it was endured by someone whose nervous system had already entered catastrophic distress hours earlier. The agony began in the garden. The blood may have begun there too. And if hematidrosis truly stands behind Luke's description, then one of the most mysterious lines in the New Testament may also be one of the most medically realistic. Not metaphor alone. A body collapsing under unbearable fear. A clinical symptom hidden for centuries inside a sacred text. The Garden of Gethsemane stops being distant religious symbolism once you see that. It becomes painfully physical. A human nervous system approaching its limit beneath olive trees in the dark, while history waits outside the garden walls.